A little bit of repetition. Welcome everybody to our great program on Maryland's vulnerable barn owls. We have great speakers tonight here for Southern Maryland Audubon. Andy Brown, who's the barn owl coordinator for the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership Farmland Raptor Program, and Alex Pellegrini, who's the research technician and who also Southern Maryland Audubon gave a scholarship to attend the International Owl Conference last year. So we're most excited to hear from both of you tonight, and I will turn it over to you for the program.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. I said I'm going to. There we go. Great. All look good?
Looks great.
Excellent. Oh, Molly, thank you very much for inviting us to talk tonight about barn owls. You know, barn owls are very special birds and close to my heart. And as you mentioned, I have pretty much dedicated you know, a great deal of my life to working with these guys. So I as you said earlier, Alex and I are representing the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership. Some of you may be familiar with that organization. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. But I spent 34 years as a naturalist with the Calvert County Natural Resources Division. And that's where I kind of cut my teeth with barn owls. During that time, I had two stints on the board of directors of Southern Maryland Audubon, and I'm proud to say that that I am currently a life member of SMAS. So it's nice to come home. Very, very good. So in the late 1980s, I was introduced to barn owls and barn owl research by Scott Smith from Maryland DNR, who has just recently retired. Many of you might know Scott with his work with bog turtles and the amphibian and reptile atlas, and prior to that, the barn owl work in the late 80s. He and Glenn Thayers, who was the Eagle fella at the time, published an article that barn owls are marsh birds too. And so I started helping Scott monitor these nest boxes that he put out in Fishing Bay over in Dorchester County. Very, very successful nesting program there. And in 1994 I decided to start a nest box project in Calvert County. We got volunteers to help us erect nest boxes. I approached Southern Maryland Audubon with a request for some funding for these nest boxes. And some of you may remember the president of that time, Dr. Jack Leidy. And we already had the Adopt an Osprey program in place. And those funds, as you know, go to support scholarships to the Hog Island Audubon camps for educators and so forth. And so I requested some funding to help with the barn owl project, and he wanted to expand that Adopt an Osprey into Adopt a Barn Owl and so forth. So we started the Raptor Conservation Committee at that time, and now that Raptor Conservation Committee is going very strong. It's a great program with Southern Maryland Audubon, and Mike is the current committee chair for the Raptor Conservation Committee. So they do a fantastic job. So we began that in 1994. And so I'm going to run through a quick short history of conservation efforts in Maryland locally for you with barn owls. In 1986, National Audubon Society designated barn owl as a species on their blue list. In 88, Maryland DNR started the nest box programs in Dorchester County, as I mentioned before, and then in Frederick County, Maryland. In 1989, Prince George's County started their nest box project. Kerry Fitzpatrick and Greg Kearns put up a number of nest boxes along the Patuxent River. And 91, Maryland designated barn owl on their watch list. 94, as I mentioned before, Calvert County started their nest box project. In 99, Melissa Boyle Akuti, who many of you know, started the St. Mary's County nest box program. Then we jumped to 2015. The Maryland State Wildlife Action Plan designated barn owl as a species of greatest conservation need. Now, what is that State Wildlife Action Plan? State Wildlife Action Plan came about from a federal grant program that gave funding to individual states for wildlife research projects. Started in 2000, and in 2005, Congress mandated that in order to apply for this grant money, you had to create, or states had to create, a state wildlife action plan that listed all of the species of greatest conservation need in the state. That state wildlife action plan is revised every 10 years. So the last revision was in 2015, and that was the date that I noted. Barn owl added as a species of greatest conservation need. Those state wildlife action plans use a universal ranking system called the S rankings, and it designates individuals, wildlife species based on their relative abundance, how endangered they are. So if we look at, it's all based along the global IUCN network of rankings. So if you look at barn owl globally, the IUCN lists them as a G5, a species of least concern globally around the world. In the US, federally, the Fish and Wildlife Service designates barn owl as an N5, same, a very secure at a low risk of extirpation. On the state level, there are also 5 different designations. S1 is critically imperiled, high risk of extirpation. S2 is imperiled, high risk of extirpation. S3, vulnerable, moderate risk. S4, apparently secure, fairly low risk. And S5 is secure. So you can see on a global and federal level, they are listed as a secure species at a low or no risk of extirpation. In 2016, the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership was founded in response to the State Wildlife Action Plan of 2015. The goal for the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership is to partner with other organizations that are working on conservation efforts for those bird species listed in the State Wildlife Action Plan as in need of greatest conservation. In 2019, we formed the Farmland Raptor Program. That came about as a result of working with Greg Kearns with Patuxent River Park and Patty Delgado of Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuary and Chris Snow of Maryland DNR Natural Resources Reserve Conservation. We developed a conservation goals for barn owls along the Patuxent River Valley. And the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership wanted to adopt those goals for their Farmland Raptor program, and which they did. We were invited, Alex and I were invited to present at the World Owl Conference this past October in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We presented a status update of the American barn owl in the mid-Atlantic states. This is a distribution map that was developed by National Audubon Society. You can see that they're found pretty much throughout the lower 48 states. They're absent in the high mountains of the Appalachian and that one little area there in Utah, I'm not sure what that's about. But they're not found in areas of cold, extreme cold climate. What this map does not show you is a relative abundance of the bird. Nature Source has pulled together all of the S designations from every state and even provinces of Canada for barn owl. This is what it looks like. 31 of the 48 lower 48 states has barn owl listed somewhere, either an S2, an S1, S2, or an S3 at some level of risk of extirpation. 31 of 48. That's a very high percentage of the states that where barn owls are struggling. Only 11 of the 48 have barn owl as an S4 or an S5, apparently secure. 5 states, barn owls are not found, they're absent, and 3 states have a designation of unknown, which means they probably haven't surveyed them. So if you're looking at barn owl and 31 of these states have them listed as some level of imperil, how can they be secure at no risk of extirpation nationally, nationwide? Let's hope the federal government kind of steps up here and kind of changes their designation on them. But it's clear to see that they are struggling pretty much everywhere, with the exception of a handful of states. What Alex and I did in order to determine the status of barn owls in the Mid-Atlantic is we looked at the most recent breeding bird atlas data from the Mid-Atlantic states, from each Mid-Atlantic state, and we contacted state wildlife representatives who were doing work with barn owls in that given state. So we're going to start here quickly and run through these. This is New Jersey. The last breeding bird atlas was in 1999. They're long overdue for getting that done. During that breeding bird atlas, they appeared in 37 of 1,032 blocks, which is 3.1%. They are listed as an S3, vulnerable. That's and talking with the state wildlife officials, they anticipate upgrading barn owl in 2025 with the next revision of the state wildlife action plan to an S1 level, critically imperiled at a very high risk of extirpation. The Delaware breeding bird atlas was in 2012. At that time, they appeared in 13 of 266 blocks. Delaware has a 4.8% occurrence in their from their breeding bird atlas. They are listed as an S2 ranking. Pennsylvania also was concluded in 2012, and they're getting ready to do a new one, start a new one this year or next year, as a matter of fact. But in 2012, you will see that they only occurred in 1.5% of the atlas blocks. They're listed in Pennsylvania as S2 status. Virginia just completed their breeding bird atlas last year in 2023. They have not finalized the analysis of the data, but they do know that barn owl occurred in less than 1% of the atlas blocks statewide, and you can see they're pretty much limited to the Shenandoah Valley there. Currently, they're listed as an S3, but I'm sure they're going to be upgraded probably to an S1 in the 2025 State Wildlife Action Plan. Most of you are aware that the Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas, the third Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas, is in its final year of data collection now. So we don't have any data, most recent data from the 2023 Atlas. However, Alex will talk to you a little bit more in detail about some of that information. But what we have right now is a comparison between the BBA 1 in 1987 and the Breeding Bird Atlas 2 in 2006. Barn owl showed a 72% decline between those two breeding bird atlases statewide. Currently, they're listed as S2, imperiled at a high risk of extirpation statewide. In the 2006 Breeding Bird Atlas 2, they occurred in 1.8% of the Atlas blocks. You can see the distribution statewide. They seem to be clustered in certain areas of central Maryland, of Frederick, Montgomery counties, the Patuxent River Valley. You can see the Delmarva, and then a few in lower southern Maryland, in St. Mary's and Charles counties. I feel very strongly that these numbers are going to be much lower than they are in 2006. And I'm hoping that with our state wildlife action plan coming out in 2025, we'll list barn owl as an S1. So we, as I mentioned before, we developed conservation goals for barn owl, and they're pretty well in place, pretty detailed and very strong for what we want to accomplish statewide with barn owls. The three other species that are identified by the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership as part of the Farmland Raptor program are short-eared owl, American kestrel, and northern harrier. Alex is going to talk to you a little bit about short-eared owls at the end of towards the end of the presentation. We just have recently, as a result of attending the World Owl Conference, we have just recently developed some pretty comprehensive short-eared owl conservation goals for Maryland. American kestrel is a tough nut to crack. That's a difficult one. We are going to work in partnership with the American Kestrel Partnership, part of Hawk Mountain and Hawkwatch, and kind of follow their guidelines on what to do with American kestrels. But we're in the process of working on them and northern harrier at the moment. So there's still a work in progress. So barn owl conservation goal, the main goal is to gain a better understanding of the ecology of barn owls in Maryland. We're talking about their reproduction and their mortality, their habitat use, their range, natal dispersal, seasonal movements, all of those population demographics that outline the ecology of these birds statewide. The main objective, the first objective that we proposed, was to obtain a baseline for statewide abundance. This is a fluid process. It changes from year to year, as we know, and it's something that we will monitor, ongoing. We've got a really good handle on. Alex has been working very hard on trying to get a good handle on where these birds are in the state of Maryland and where they're nesting and so forth. As a result of this statewide abundance survey, we would then identify those critical habitat areas, identify those areas, work to try to protect them if possible, and establish a nest box monitoring program in those critical habitats. Ensure adequate and consistent monitoring. This is where we try to employ as much volunteer assistance as we can for monitoring the nest boxes. Our goal here is to band as many barn owls, chicks and adults, in the state of Maryland as possible, because that's where we get our information about those population demographics outlined above. Broaden citizen participation, as I mentioned before, through the monitoring program, and then be the principal gateway for information, disseminating information as well as collecting information. And Alex is going to talk to you a little bit about how we're doing that through a program called Nest Story. About 4 years ago, we started trapping adult barn owls at the nests, where we were participating in a morphology study with the Global Owl Project to try to iron out some of the taxonomy for barn owls globally, trying to assist the efforts to separate American barn owl from common barn owl. And it looks like that's in the process and is happening. But anyhow, we started collecting morphological data from adult barn owls by trapping them at the nest box and collecting a series of body measurements. One of the things that resulted from our adult trapping was a tremendous amount of recovery data, about 300 times more recovery data than we got from just banding the chicks. We learned so much more in 4 years than we did in 40 years of just banding chicks, which is really amazing. We've gained a lot of really cool information about their population dynamics and their population ecology. For example, site and mate fidelity. Only 4% of the birds in our study areas, we have two particular study areas that we trapped adults in. Only 4% kept the same mate from year to year. And only 19% kept the same nest box from year to year. There's a lot of movement going on among these populations, which is really kind of cool. The age structure of the adults birds breeding in our study populations were much older birds. 62% were designated as what we call after third year, at least 3 years old or older. 10% were third year birds and 28% were second year birds. And those are birds who are breeding in their first season, their first nesting season. Recruitment and immigration into our population. 55% of the birds, the adult birds that we caught, were new to the study area, which is pretty amazing. They were either banded somewhere else and moved into the study area, or they were unbanded birds that were nesting in our study areas for the first time. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of movement going on. We found some significant differences between our two study sites, one on the eastern shore, lower eastern shore at Menai Bay, and the other along the Patuxent River Valley. The eastern shore seems to have a limiting factor of appropriate nest sites. We put nest boxes up and they seem to be occupied very, very quickly. We found birds nesting in places that you normally don't find them. On the left here is a pair of owls nesting in the attic of a house that is actually occupied by people living in it still, and that's the first time I've ever heard of that. The bird on the right there was a nest that was laid on the balcony of a condominium just outside of, or actually in Crisfield, Maryland, and they raised a family on the balcony of the condominium. On 2 accounts, we had them nesting in large machinery, large heavy equipment. So clearly, nest site availability is a limiting factor on the eastern shore. We found a difference in their diet between the two study sites. When we trap the owls, they are bringing food to the chicks to feed them, and so we can analyze what the prey is. On the eastern shore, they feed almost entirely meadow-voles. 100% of the prey brought to the nest were meadow-voles. The majority of them were intact, as opposed to the Patuxent River, which were more than 80% marsh rice rat. And marsh rice rats are found in more brackish, fresher marshes than are what are found on the eastern shore. A lot of times, the majority of the time, when the prey was brought to the nest, it was headless. So the adults are eating the head and bringing the leftovers to the chicks. And this is a quick story about one of the things we found in one of our nest boxes over on Menai Bay. We trapped both adults, a male and a female. Both were banded. So after the evening, went back and looked up their band numbers. Well, it turns out they were actually siblings. They had both hatched in the same nest 2 years prior, brother and sister, and they were a mated pair raising young of their own. The following year, we came back to the same nest box, trapped both adults again, same male. However, he had a new wife. He got rid of his sister, and he was now mated with an older woman who had nested prior years in an adjacent nest box. So he was able to lure her away from her current husband and coax her into nesting with him. So a lot of drama going on in that population of barn owls. So it's uh, it's really quite fascinating learning so many new things about their dynamics, their population dynamics, just through the adult trapping. So at this point, I want to unshare my screen and turn it over to Alex, and he's going to talk to you about some of the distribution and some of the work that we've been doing statewide.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, perfect. All right. So my name's Alex Pellegrini, as I've been introduced. Barn owls are just so cool. Am I right? I mean, look at this thing. It's beautiful. They're mysterious. They're elegant. Everything you could possibly want in a bird. And I've been working with barn owls for, why does this not work? There we go. For about 2 years now. You can see on the left there, it was the first time I ever got to band a barn owl chick. You can see the excitement in my face. On the right there, my most recent time banding barn owl chicks, actually just on Monday. The excitement's still alive. It'll truly never go away. I just love working with this species. I am so privileged to be able to do it, and thank you, Andy, and everybody who's given me the opportunity to do so. And while I get to do all this super cool field work, there's also some incredibly important and very, very cool behind the scenes work that goes on, and that's what I'm going to try to give you all an inside look on today. I'm going to tone down the science and lift up the curtain a bit and let you in on what goes on behind the scenes to work on the conservation of these birds in Maryland. So my first real project here was working on this workspace called Nestory. And Nestory is a data repository that basically allows us to keep our data private in a data habitat, as they call it. And we can work with this live in the field. We can, as we check nest boxes, we can enter that data. As we band adults, we can record observations on site and so much more, and then refer back to this data later on so that we can see how nest success of barn owls has evolved over the years. And this was a fairly quick process compared to what I will call my first real project, which was to drive over to the Eastern Shore to this little field office here, this Maryland DNR field office, and meet a gentleman who Andy spoke about a bit named Scott Smith. And Scott Smith in the late 80s and early 90s worked absolutely tirelessly to collect as many records of barn owls in the state as he possibly could. I was able to obtain 145 records from him, but I'm sure you can imagine that as he was working on this in the late 80s and early 90s, he didn't hand me this in the little pocket-sized flash drive form that my generation's so accustomed to. Instead, I walked in, he handed me a huge storage bin full of stacks of paper and hand-drawn maps and phone call records and all things of that sort. So for the next 5 hours in that little field office, the copier was my best friend. I was copying all these records, reading through them, and then I moved on to interpreting these hand-drawn maps and really trying to pin down exactly where he was finding these barn owls, for that first. So you can imagine, and some of you know, there's some feedback going on that some people don't like. But as you know, land use has changed a lot in the last 30 years since Scott Smith looked at the population. So here you can see, just a bit before Scott Smith started looking in 1973, the red there represents the developed land in Maryland. And then in 2010, you can see there's way more developed land in Maryland. There's a lot of red on that map. And barn owls do not thrive in these areas. Their optimal habitat is grasslands and meadows and pasture land, orchards, marshes, not row crops, so not, heavily industrialized type of agriculture, rural areas where they are, spraying rodenticides and pesticides, not, shopping malls, as I came to find out when I was throwing the Scott Smith's pins on a map. He said that it was, let's say, a tree nest cavity, and I said, okay, well, it's right here on this road, but this is now a shopping mall, and these birds were not nesting in a shopping mall in the late 80s and early 90s. So a lot's changed over time, and it really gave us the need to look to more modern sources of data. So we turned to the largest citizen science project in the entire world, which is eBird. Over 600,000 users contribute 100 million observations a year. So there's a lot to pull from here. And we contacted our friends at the Breeding Bird Atlas, and they were able to, lend us the data. I get updates on this every month. And we were able to accumulate over 800 records from them. This still wasn't enough. So I turned to iNaturalist and our friends at the Maryland Biodiversity Project, and they were able to contribute what they had as well. And all in all, with all these data sources combined, we ended up with 1,139 records of barn owls in Maryland. So that's a whole lot. And with all those records, we were able to make this map here. And not all of these points on this map are necessarily nesting barn owls. This is everything from barn owls heard flying over somebody's house in December when they're not usually nesting, to somebody flushing one from the side of the road, just absolutely anything. But this gave us a lot to pull from and a lot to look at, and it has allowed us to really have a better understanding of how barn owls move throughout the state of Maryland, where they're nesting that we don't already know about. And I want you to take a really good at this map. I want you to, absorb how much of a mess it is, because when I flip to this side here, you're going to see a lot less points on this map. And this is all of the confirmed barn owl nest sites for 2022 and 2023. Now, only about 32 to 40 known nests occurred during those last 2 years. And, that's a lot different from the 1,139 data points that I have here. But nonetheless, what this leads us to believe is that there are a lot more nesting barn owls in the state, or at least more, if not a lot more, than we currently know about. So, we have to do more. We have to learn more. And we were so graciously presented with the opportunity to attend the World Owl Conference in Onalaska, Wisconsin in October. And we learned so much there. We connected with barn owl researchers from all over the world, other owl researchers. We learned, methodologies and techniques that we had never heard of. But most importantly, what we really came across was, something called ARUs. And I just wanted to point out the, folks in this photo here. We have David Johnson right next to Andy in that picture there on the right. A good friend to us all, huge mentor. Melissa Boyle there. That's us sitting at the table at the conference, taking all that we can in. And, before these photos were taken, we attended a workshop with Wildlife Acoustics. And that little green box right there on my left is an ARU that I mentioned. And ARU stands for Automated Recording Unit. And what we can do with these fancy little devices is we can set them up so that they can record autonomously on a set schedule from sun up to sundown every 30 minutes with 30-minute breaks in between. You can change this schedule and it records everything in the area. Now, these are out currently right now. They're going to turn on, in 45 minutes or so after we speak, and they're going to begin recording. And they've been doing this for about a month now. And we're in the process of analyzing this data. And we analyze this data with something called Kaleidoscope Pro. And Kaleidoscope, it's this, new fancy technology where you can analyze, huge samples of audio from weeks, months and years with the click of a few buttons. And what we're going to do is we're going to train it to identify and recognize barn owl vocalizations, pick them out, and then we'll be able to know that barn owls occurred during this time in this given location within a optimistic detection radius of 1 kilometer, but more likely 0.5 kilometer, so very close by. We can target nest box efforts, landowner communication, and this is much more effective. That's something I had to do shortly after making the map and collecting as much data as possible, which I effectively turned into a solicitor and called random people, essentially. They were educated guesses based off of the data we had, based off of people who lived within suitable habitat. I turned up nothing. It's very hard to make somebody pick up an unknown phone number, but with these automated recording units, we're gonna be able to concentrate our efforts more effectively. Now, I mentioned that we learned the ARU thing. I hope to be speaking with you in, a few years down the line, telling you how successful this effort was and how many more barn owls in the state we know about. But as Andy mentioned, they're not the only species of concern for the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership's Farmland Raptor program. Short-eared owls also are, and we just couldn't get enough. We heard people talking about short-eared owls at the conference, all the research they were doing. We thought to ourselves, hey, this is just as cool of a species. It's not going to interrupt our barn owl season. Species of concern in Maryland that we need to learn a lot about. And we thought, we just don't have enough sleepless nights per year. We need more of them. So we really dove in head first. And it's not so bad when you get to spend time outside in these beautiful locations under these beautiful sunsets. And, we were prepared to do this. We had communicated with all these researchers at the conference, working with short-eared owls. In particular, this woman named Sophie, who was able to put us in touch with so many people around the world. I actually found somebody on Facebook. I just happened to come across a post, and they posted pictures of them banding short-eared owls. I contacted him. It turns out that he lived in the UK, and it turns out that he was the most successful barn owl bander that we had spoken to. He banded over 120 barn owls this winter. Short-eared owls, excuse me, this winter. And short-eared owls are not an easy thing to band. I'll add that there's only been one adult banded in the state of Maryland ever, and there's a good reason for that, as you'll come to find out. So, we got right to it. We took the advice from the gentleman in the UK who suggested that we use mist nets. In the UK, you're not allowed to use things such as baluster trees, which I'll talk about a bit later. But with these mist nets, he suggested that we put audio lures with male hoot vocalizations at the bottom of these mist nets. We set them up in the dark, and then the owls will effectively be attracted to the male hoots, and they will fly into the mist net, and we'll have ourselves a short-eared owl. Now, other than this, because we don't live in the UK, we use some other methods, such as this pole method you see here, this perch pole method, and it has these microfilament nooses, which you'll get a closer look at in a second on top. Short-eared owls like to perch. They live in these open grasslands, so there's not a lot of perch availability. So we were hoping that our perch would be attractive enough that they would land on it. A light goes on when they land on it, and boom, we got ourselves a short-eared owl. Now on the right, that's Andy and I setting up a baluster tree. Here's a better shot of that. Me pointing to Andy hammering in that baluster tree in the ground so that our trigger light works. There's a starling in there. On the right, there's a meadow vole in there, and you can see those little microfilament nooses on top, that fishing line. And what happens is the short-eared owl will come down on it, want some food, want the meadow vole, their starling, and get its feet tangled in those microfilament nooses. So I'm sure that's not what all of your eyes were drawn to here. I'm sure you're looking at those bright orange potato chips in the baluster tree with that meadow vole, and yes, those are Doritos. We did this by the advice of David Johnson of the Global Owl Project, who found that Doritos were just the most hardy chip that were able to stand up through the night to the meadow voles' urine and feces as they, defecated and went to the bathroom all over these things, and they stayed crunchy. So as the meadow voles moved around, it would create this crunching noise, and then next to these baluster trees, we would put some microtus vocalizations. So these meadow voles making little squeaking sounds, and in combination with the crunching and the squeaking, the short-eared owls, the idea was that they just couldn't resist, and hopefully we would catch them. Now, the idea behind this project is that we're going to be collaborating with, researchers all over the world. So we are in the process with Sophie forming a short-eared owl working group, and we would like to draw blood. We would like to do morphometric work and taxonomy work with this species, and eventually do some transmitter work. And you can see just how cool this transmitter work is. There was a gentleman by the name of Travis Booms, and this other researcher by the last name of Johnson, who did this study. And what you can see is they tagged these short-eared owls in Alaska, and they did this with rocket nets and helicopters. So they'd fly around in helicopters and shoot the rocket net and catch these owls in flight, and then put these GPS tags on them. And then these owls, they found out, flew all the way from Alaska down to Utah, Colorado, into Texas, and even down into Mexico. It is just incredible what they truly did. And we don't really have a good idea of short-eared owl seasonal movement patterns, especially in the East, which is why this is such an important study to pursue. However, I'm going to show you this, and you'll see that Andy right here is not holding a short-eared owl. And despite the countless nights we spent outside, the countless hours we spent outside this season, we did not give one. But that is the nature of the beast. We are determined and will continue next year, adjusting our trapping methods, learning a whole lot. We don't have much to work with because nobody has really been successful in banding short-eared owls. So along with all the blood work and morphometric work and everything we're doing, the trapping methods that we find to be successful are going to be just as important for the continuation of research on this species. And this is a collaborative effort. We're excited for it to be, as it is the mission of the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership to create partnerships that advance the conservation of bird species, in this instance, farmland raptor species in critical need of conservation in Maryland, the short-eared owl being one of them, with an S1B status, critically imperiled. So I could give you an absolute ear beating about these two birds. I love them. I'll talk them to death. But for now, I just want to leave you with this quote that really speaks to me. Because the truth of the matter is, as Roger Tory Peterson said, the birds could very well live without us, but many, perhaps all of us, would find life incomplete, indeed almost intolerable without the birds. And we just want to acknowledge all our partners in these efforts, listed here on the screen. We truly could not make any of this happen without y'all. That's it. Let me stop sharing here.
Well, Alex and Andy, thank you so much. You are just doing amazing research, and this has been absolutely fascinating. Can't thank you enough for sharing it with us all. We have a couple of questions here in the chat. And if folks have other questions, you can either put them in the chat box, or after we do these questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. So John asked, if you put up a nest box, what can you do to attract owls? Or do you just have to hope if you build it, they will come?
Well, if anybody spends any time with me, they quickly hear me say it's all about the food. And so if there's food available, you're going to have whatever species it is going to be living in that area. Okay. So barn owls feed almost entirely on meadow voles, as we saw, and meadow voles are present in pasture land, as Alex was mentioning, pasture land, fallow fields, grasslands. They do not exist in agricultural settings, corn fields, soybean fields. You know, a cornfield, unfortunately, is probably one of the most sterile environments that we have in our landscape. Those plants are genetically modified to withstand an immense amount of herbicide and pesticide application, and so they liberally spray those agricultural fields and kill everything but the corn or everything but the beans. And so they're probably one of the most sterile environments that we have. Even though you see a lot of farmland around, it's not suitable farmland. It's not suitable habitat. So one of the things that we don't know that we would like to try to find out through this population demographic studies is what is their feeding range? What is their territories? A lot of work has been done in Europe and in the Far East on barn owl foraging territories, but we don't know that in our area. So it's that's where there's good habitat, then you're going to attract the owls. So it's not as simple as put a box up and they will find it. They've got to have a reason to come to the area, and that reason is food.
And then a follow-up to that, Karen asked, has anyone studied the issues of rodenticides?
There has been a lot of work done with rodenticide levels in barn owls in other countries. Not so much in the U.S. and certainly much fewer less work in the eastern U.S. So unfortunately, it's a in order to measure rodenticide levels, you need tissue sample. So you're talking about a dead bird, and that bird has to be relatively recently died because the liver breaks down rapidly in decomposition. So it's a tricky process, but that's something we definitely want to find out.
And Wayne asked, it sounds like you need an organized system for volunteers. You're doing a lot of work and are spread out.
We rely on other organizations to manage our volunteers for us. Other organizations like Southern Maryland Audubon, like Calvert County Natural Resources Division, like the Patuxent River Park, like the Frederick Bird Club. So we kind of work with those organizations to manage the volunteer effort to work on these projects within that given area.
And Cindy asked, is there any overlap between the habitat of the barred owl and the barn owl?
Not so much. Barred owls are in the South, they're called the swamp owl, right? Okay, because they live in those forested wetlands. Here in our area, they like wooded ravines, creeks and things, habitat like that. They've also have transitioned more into an urban wildlife species. So they are doing quite well in human areas, okay, human development areas. Barn owl is very, very secretive, very, very sensitive to human disturbance, and therefore he's only found in those places where there's good ample grassland and pasture land, and it's relatively quiet. There is more overlap between barn and great horned than there is between barn and barred.
And another question, do other owls kill barn owls?
They will if given the opportunity. Now, a barn owl is probably one of our most agile nighttime flyers. He's got extremely long wings and is very good at maneuvering. He can stop on a dime, make a dive, and is a master predator because of his agility in flight. So therefore, he's pretty good at night eluding nighttime avian predators, okay, which would be barred or great horned. So they do fall prey if they're flushed during the daytime hours. If they're forced to leave their day roost and fly during the day, they do fall prey to diurnal raptors like red-tailed hawks, for example. And then they're susceptible to depredation while they're roosting, and certainly chicks in a cavity. So.
And I have a question for Alex. Alex, how did you get involved in owl research, and what kind of studies did you do that led up to that?
Oh, that's such a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. Networking is everything and it's who you know. So I worked at Phoenix Wildlife Center, doing rehab work with Kathy Woods, and she suggested that I go apply to Patuxent River, or go apply to the Jug Bay area and try to work there. I was introduced to Greg Kearns, and then he got me started, with ospreys and soras, and barn owls were a part of that as well. And then I met Andy there one night, and then later down the line, Kathy, suggested that I, try to work with the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership, given my interest in raptors. And just so happened that Andy was leading up the project there as well. So we got to work together more and really get to know each other. And, I've just kind of fallen headfirst into it ever since.
Well, that's an amazing trajectory. What a great career path.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
We have another question. Up at Conterra near Laurel, Maryland, folks go to observe short-eared owls. Can those be trapped and banded?
Go ahead, Alex.
Well, they can if we can get them, right? We've tried actually there. I think it was two or three nights, maybe just two. We were there, and the problem that I didn't really get into was that this most successful gentleman we met in the UK suggested that he was more successful towards the beginning of their, wintering season here. So with them arriving in November, but with us starting in, I think it was like January even.
Yeah, it was even February, I think.
It was even February, yeah. So,
Yeah.
We came home from the World Owl Conference and we had to get all our, thoughts in order, and it took a while. We had to come up with project proposals and whatnot, and we didn't get out in the field until February. So next year we're hoping to try right when they get there, and we think we'll have a lot more success. But theoretically, they can be trapped anywhere where they occur, in theory, yeah.
Theoretically.
Yes, exactly.
So you had the cool map that showed the migration from Alaska down to as far as Zacatecas in Mexico. Do you
Yep.
know where our short-eared owls come from?
No.
Nope. That's what we're hoping to investigate further. Because then we can create partnerships, across their migratory routes and stopovers, and work to conserve them.
And Alex, could you talk a little bit more about the northern harrier and what y'all are finding about it? Because it's such an amazing bird.
I can. I'll pass it off to Andy in a second, but we have not moved on to that species yet. As Wayne noticed, we are doing a lot of work and we're spread out pretty thin. So barn owls have been the main focus of the Farmland Raptor project. We're moving into short-eared owls and then future plans for kestrels. But as far as northern harriers go, they have not been a main focus yet. But if Andy has anything to add.
So Harrier was chosen because not because of their wintering population in Maryland, but because there are a few breeding bird records of Harrier in the state, and so they're not many, but that's something. And historically, there were more than there are now, and they're grassland birds. Just like kestrels and barn owls are. So that's why they were selected, and we really are just beginning to look at what we can do with harriers in Maryland. Obviously the first step would be to get Maryland birds banded, during the winter months, and next step would be to survey, to see if there are any other breeding records, find those historic breeding records and survey those sites during the nesting season to see if they're still around or still active. So I think that's the beginning of the work that we may pursue with Harrier. But we just have, we've been pretty much, as Alex said, involved with the barn owls and the short ears. So.
We have a couple of more minutes before we need to wrap up. If anybody else out there has another question, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, this is Lisa Garrett.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, I'm the president of Prince George's Audubon Society.
Yes.
Yes, and we would love to have you and Alex talk about some of your projects. I'm going to still ask, how do we contact you? Does Molly have that information?
Yeah, or you can certainly reach me at Farmland Raptors with an S
Okay.
at marylandbirds.org.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay. And also I'm working on a small exhibit about barn owls at my new nature center. And I'd love to have some information from you and Alex that we could present to the public, because they ask a lot about the different owls that are around the area.
Yeah, absolutely.
They remember barn owls from all the tobacco barns in Calvert County, and where are they now? So I'll reach out to you about that, because I really feel like that's a big reason why we don't see them anymore.
Yep. Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
And that begs a question. Are there any known nests that y'all know of in tobacco barns currently?
Yes.
Not as opposed to a nest box?
Yes,
Just a natural nest in a barn?
right.
Not to my knowledge.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much, Alex and Andy. This has just been an absolutely fascinating presentation, and it's everyone's favorite owl, as you can tell by the great turnout we had. We really, really appreciate you coming, and we appreciate even more the amazing work you're doing.
Well, thanks for having us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, and good night, everybody.